Desmond Wright was 38 years old when his wife divorced him. He had a struggling startup, a modest apartment in Atlanta, and a federal grant bid that hadn't landed yet. No investors, no safety net, nothing. Bianca didn't just leave, she had been planning it for 4 months, timing the filing carefully so she'd walk away clean before any of his work paid off. She signed the papers, took what she could, and moved on. Her brother told people Desmond would never recover. Her closest friend helped make sure of it. For 14 months, nobody heard much from Desmond Wright. Then Bedrock Signal closed a $300 million Series B. His face landed on the cover of a regional business magazine, and his phone rang for 48 hours straight. One of those calls was from Bianca. She left a voicemail. She wanted to reconnect. She called it closure. Desmond listened to it once, set his phone face down, and finished his coffee. What happened next, she never saw coming. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. Desmond knew it before he picked up the mug. He picked it up anyway, took a sip, set it back down on the corner of the drawing he'd been annotating since 4:47 a.m. The liquid was bitter and flat. He barely noticed. His eyes were already back on the grid. The kitchen table was covered. 3 large sheets of technical drawings, each one marked in his own hand. Red pencil for load calculations, blue for signal routing, green for the underground conduit paths that would carry fiber cable beneath 17 miles of rural Georgia road. Color-coded and deliberate. Every mark had a reason. That was how Desmond worked. Nothing went on paper without a reason behind it. The apartment around him was quiet in the way that early mornings are quiet in West End. A heavy, patient silence, the kind that belongs to people up before the city. The building was a solid 1940s brick walk-up, 2 bedrooms, high ceilings, wood floors that creaked in the same 3 spots every time. Not the house they'd talked about in the early years. Not Buckhead. Not Brookhaven. Not anywhere with a garage and a yard and room enough for the things they once planned to fill a house with. But it was not a failure either. Desmond had made his peace with the distance between where he was and where he was going. He had always been good at that. The distance was just math. Math had a solution if you worked it long enough. The worn copy of Digital Signal Processing, Principles and Applications sat at the edge of the table. A dozen sticky notes flagging chapters he'd returned to since starting Bedrock Signal. The cover was soft from years of handling. He'd bought it his 2nd semester at Howard, 20 years ago, from a used bookstore on Georgia Avenue for $4.50. He remembered the exact price. He remembered most things that had cost him something. He uncapped the green pencil and bent back over the drawing. He heard her before he saw her. The soft drag of her slippers on the hallway floor. Then the creak of the 3rd board from the bathroom door, the one he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. He did not look up. Bianca moved into the kitchen the way she always did in the morning, slowly, with a kind of graceful ease, like the day was already arranged to her liking and she was simply walking through it. She wore her work clothes, a deep burgundy blazer over a cream blouse, her hair pulled back smooth. She looked put together in the precise, effortless way that had always made Desmond feel, in their early years, like he was watching someone walk out of a magazine. That feeling had changed. He couldn't name exactly when. Some feelings change so slowly, you only notice them after they're already gone. She poured her coffee and glanced at the table. "You're at it early." She said it with a small smile, warm and easy, the same smile she'd been giving him for 6 years. "Grant's submission window closes Friday," he said, without looking up. "Want to get the routing specs locked before the site visit?" She leaned against the counter, mug cradled in both hands. Her eyes moved across the drawings, not reading them, just acknowledging them, the way you acknowledge something in a language you've decided not to learn. "I'm sure it's going to be great," she said. "You always figure it out." She said it the way you'd say, "Drive safe," or "Have a good day." The words were right. The weight behind them was gone. Desmond capped the green pencil. He reached for the red one. "Thanks," he said. She rinsed her mug, set it in the rack, touched his shoulder once with her palm. Light, brief, the kind of touch that is more habit than feeling, and went to finish getting ready. He listened to the sounds of the apartment around her, the bathroom door, the soft rush of water, the slide of a closet. He looked at the spot on his shoulder where her hand had been. Then he looked back at the drawing. She left at 7:40, same as always. A quick goodbye from the hallway. He called back from the table. The front door closed with its usual click. Desmond sat for a moment. Then he turned to the third sheet of drawings, the most technical of the three, the one that carried the proprietary routing protocol he'd spent 4 months developing. The thing that made this bid different from every other bid in the pile on some federal program officer's desk. The thing that could change everything. He thought about the last time Bianca had asked about the grant. She used to ask every morning, "How's the bid coming? Did you hear back from the program office? What do you need?" Specific questions. Real ones. The kind that meant she had been listening the day before. 3 weeks ago, those questions had stopped. He hadn't named it until just now. He named it now, quietly, the way you name a thing once you've decided to stop pretending you haven't noticed it. He capped the red pencil, picked up his cold coffee, finished it. Then he rolled up the drawings, tucked them under his arm, grabbed his keys, and walked out into the gray Atlanta morning to do his work. The thumb drive was on his desk, right where he'd left it, sitting on top of the signal processing manual he'd pulled that morning and never put back. He grabbed it, dropped it into his jacket pocket, and stood there for a second in the quiet of the apartment. It was 2:11 p.m. The apartment felt different in the afternoon, smaller somehow. The light came in at a low angle through the west-facing window and turned the wood floors gold. He was already moving back toward the front door when something caught his eye. A folder on the kitchen counter. Manila, standard size, sitting open at an angle like it had been set down in a hurry. He didn't recognize it. He set his keys on the counter and looked at it without touching it. The top page was a legal document. He could see that much from where he stood. He could see his own name, Desmond Cole Wright. He stepped closer. He read the first page twice. Then he read it a third time, slowly, the way he read specs when something didn't add up. It was a draft divorce petition, his name on the left, Bianca Nadia Wright on the right. An attorney's letterhead across the top from a firm he'd never heard of. Whitmore and Associates, a Midtown Atlanta address. The grounds stated were irreconcilable differences. The date was at the top right corner. 4 months ago. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he began to turn pages. The financial disclosure section came after the third page. Printed tables, clean and organized. Assets, liabilities, estimated valuations. His name attached to Bedrock Signal. His startup, listed under marital assets with a question mark where a valuation should have been. He saw that question mark, and something shifted behind his eyes. He kept turning. The handwriting appeared on page 5. Her handwriting. He knew it immediately. The small, neat letters. The way she drew her sevens with a European cross. She'd left margin notes along the right side of the page, some underlined, some circled. He leaned in close and read them one by one. Asset protection, future upturn? Timing matters. Filed before or after valuation event? Ask W. Re, business interest carve-out. If grant clears, what does that change? He stood at the kitchen counter and read those notes 3 times. The afternoon light sat still on the floor. Outside, somewhere down the block, a car went by with its music up. Then it was quiet again. He took out his phone. He photographed every page, front to back, margins included, the attorney's letterhead, and the date on page 1. He was precise about it. No blurring, no cut-off corners. When he was done, he scrolled through each image to confirm they were clear. Then he put his phone in his pocket. He lifted each page and placed it back exactly as he had found it. He checked the angle of the folder against the edge of the counter. He adjusted it slightly. He looked at it for another 3 seconds. Then he picked up his keys and walked out. The Publix on Cascade Road had a parking lot that was never fully empty and never fully full. He pulled into a space at the far edge near the cart return, cut the engine, and sat. He did not call anyone. He did not look at his phone. He put both hands in his lap and looked at the middle distance, the side of the building, the paint faded near the roofline, a shopping cart sitting at a slight angle against the curb. He had loved her. That was not a small thing. He had loved her since the second year of graduate school, when she'd shown up to his study group with a 3-page color-coded outline and argued with the professor by email until he corrected the syllabus. He had loved her through the first miscarriage, when she went silent for 2 weeks, and he sat with her silence because he didn't know what else to do. He had loved her through the second one, which was worse, and through the way they'd both agreed without saying it out loud to stop talking about it. He had loved her through his co-founder leaving, through the lean months, through every morning at that table. He sat with all of that for a while. Then, slowly and deliberately, he moved it somewhere else. Not gone, not buried. Just placed somewhere it could not interfere with what he needed to think about. He started working the problem. 4 months. She had been sitting on this for 4 months. The margin notes weren't questions she was asking herself. They were questions she'd been researching. Ask W. That meant she had already spoken to someone. Maybe Philip. Probably Philip. The circled phrase about the grant, if grant clears, what does that change, told him she understood more about his business timeline than she had ever let on, which meant she had thought about his success not as something to share, but as a variable to manage. He worked it for 45 minutes. When he was done, the grief had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape. It was harder now, and it was useful. He started the car and drove home. She came through the door at 6:50, a grocery bag in one arm. She'd picked up salmon and a bottle of wine, she said. She felt like cooking. She moved through the kitchen with her easy warmth, asking about his site visit, telling him something small and forgettable about a co-worker's mistake at the office. She laughed once, a real laugh, and the sound of it landed somewhere in Desmond's chest like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. He watched her. He said the right things. He ate the meal she cooked and told her it was good, which it was. He watched the way she reached for the wine glass, the way she tucked her feet under her on the couch afterward, the way she fell asleep easily while he lay awake beside her in the dark. He watched her the way he watched a structure he now knew had been built wrong. Not angry, not yet, just precise, cataloging. Noting where the stress lines were and where they ran, and how deep they went. The ceiling above him was still and white. He did not sleep for a long time. He ran calculations instead. The papers came to his office, not the apartment, not a neutral location. His office, the shared co-working suite on Peters Street where he kept his second monitor, and his whiteboards, and the framed Howard University engineering certificate that had survived 3 moves. A process server walked into the building at 11:40 a.m. on a Thursday and asked the front desk for Desmond Cole Wright by full name. Kezia would later call it deliberate. She would use the word destabilizing with the flat precision of someone naming a legal tactic rather than a human choice. She was right on both counts. He signed for the envelope. He carried it to his desk. He read the documents with the same methodical attention he'd given the draft in the apartment, page by page. Nothing skipped. The same attorney's letterhead, the same date structure, updated now to reflect the current week. The question mark beside Bedrock Signal's valuation had been replaced with a number so low it was almost insulting. He put the documents in his desk drawer, locked it, and went back to work on the grant bid. He did not hear from Bianca until that evening. She had prepared for the conversation. He could tell by the way she sat down across from him at the kitchen table, not beside him, across from him, and folded her hands in her lap. She had the careful posture of someone who had rehearsed, who had decided on an opening line and practiced saying it without her voice breaking. "I need to be honest with you," she said. "I've been unhappy for a long time." He watched her. He said nothing. "I know this is hard to hear, but I need to be honest. I think we've been moving in different directions for a while now." She paused. "You've been so distant, so consumed by the business. I've tried to be supportive, but I honestly don't believe in it the way I used to." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I want to be honest with you. This isn't about punishing you. I just can't keep doing this." 4 times. He counted all 4. The speech lasted 6 minutes. It was not without feeling. Her voice did tighten near the end, and he believed that part of it was real. It just wasn't the part she'd led with. When she finished, the apartment was quiet. He asked one question. "How long have you been planning this?" She met his eyes. Steady, practiced. "A few weeks." "Okay," he said. That was all. She waited for more. When it didn't come, something flickered across her face. Relief, or maybe its close cousin. She reached across the table briefly, stopped short of touching his hand, and stood. She told him they could talk more tomorrow. She told him she was sorry. She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He called Kezia at 10:47 p.m. She answered on the second ring. He could hear from her voice that she was already awake, already somewhere quiet. Her home office, probably. The one with the lamp that threw warm yellow light, and the shelf of case binders she alphabetized every January. "She served you," Kezia said. It was not a question. "This morning, at the office." A pause. "Of course she did." "There's something I need to tell you," Kezia said. "I should have told you before now. I've been trying to figure out how, and I waited too long, and I'm sorry for that." He said nothing. He waited. 8 weeks ago, Bar Association dinner at the Intercontinental. Her voice was controlled, but he knew her well enough to hear the anger beneath it. Low and pressurized, like something sealed in a container too small for it. Philip was there. He was drinking, not sloppy, but comfortable. He made a comment. She paused. "He said Bianca was finally cutting the cord before you dragged her down any further." Those were his words. Finally cutting the cord. Desmond was still. "He said it like it was done," Kezia continued, "like it had already been decided and executed, and he was just acknowledging a fact. He was not talking about a woman who'd recently made a difficult personal decision. He was talking like a man who had been part of making it." She stopped. "I should have called you that night. I didn't. I've been sitting with that. How long ago did you say this was?" 8 weeks. He did the math without meaning to. 8 weeks ago, he and Bianca had gone to dinner in Decatur for no particular reason. She had laughed at something he said. She had reached across the table and squeezed his hand. He let that land, and then he moved it. "Thank you," he said. "Get some sleep." He hung up and sat with it, all of it, the full shape of it, in the quiet kitchen. The folder, the margin notes, timing matters. 4 months of planning. Philip's casual past tense at a Bar Association dinner. A speech delivered with rehearsed sorrow. A hand that almost touched his. This had never been a marriage falling apart. This had been an exit managed from a distance by more than one person for longer than he had known. He sat with that until it was no longer a shock, until it was just a fact. Then he went to bed. 14 months later, Bedrock Signal closed a $300 million Series B on a Wednesday morning. By Friday, Desmond's face was on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle, above a headline that read, "The Infrastructure Man." His phone had not stopped ringing in 48 hours. Investors, journalists, old colleagues, people he hadn't spoken to in years who suddenly had something to say. One of the calls was from Bianca. He let it go to voicemail. He listened to it once, standing at his kitchen window. A different kitchen now, higher up, with a view of the city that still surprised him some mornings. Then he placed his phone face down on the counter and finished his coffee. The voicemail was 43 seconds long. He knew because he had played it twice already. Once the night before, standing at his kitchen window, and once this morning at his desk, with the city just starting to wake up outside the glass. Her voice was warm, careful. She said she'd seen the news about Bedrock Signal and that she was happy for him, genuinely. She said she'd been thinking about him. She said she hoped they could talk. She used the word closure, which he noted the way a surveyor notes an irregularity in the ground. He set his phone down. 50 employees worked beyond that glass wall. He could see them arriving in ones and twos, coffee cups, laptop bags, the low hum of a company with somewhere to be. 14 months ago, this had been a two-man operation with one man left. A folding table in a co-working suite. A grant application nobody thought he'd win. He thought about those months the way a man thinks about a hard winter after it's over. Not with pain, exactly. With a kind of clear, cold respect. The divorce had cost him. He wanted to be honest with himself about that. Bianca's attorney came in aggressive from the first filing. Motions, valuations, language designed to tire him out and drain him down. Kezia had sat across from him at her kitchen table 3 weeks into it and said, plainly, "You can fight every inch of this and probably win more than you'll give up. But it will take 2 years. It will take your attention. And the grant window closes in 5 months. So he'd let the apartment go. He'd let a portion of the savings go. He'd signed where they asked him to sign, and he'd kept Bedrock Signal's structure clean and untouched, and entirely his. Bianca and Philip had watched him walk away from that table and seen a man with nothing left to protect. That was fine. That was useful. The grant came through on a Tuesday in February, 11 months ago now. Rural connectivity infrastructure across 4 southeast states. The kind of federal contract that didn't make headlines until it did. The Birmingham partnership followed 6 weeks later. A regional telecom firm that needed exactly the kind of routing architecture Desmond had been developing quietly, stubbornly, during the months when the apartment was empty and the whiteboards were his only company. The routing protocol wasn't elegant at first. It was built in grief, honest about it, and then refined past it until it was something that could stand on its own. He had named it, privately, in his notes, Patience. He'd never told anyone that. On Sunday morning, he drove south on I-75 with the windows down. Macon was 90 miles from Atlanta, and Walter Wright's yard was another world entirely. A 1/4 acre of red Georgia clay that Walter had been working since retirement, growing tomatoes and okra and whatever else cooperated with the soil. Walter was on his knees by the garden bed when Desmond pulled up. He heard the car, looked back once without surprise, and went back to what he was doing. Desmond sat on the back porch steps and waited until Walter was ready. That was how it had always worked between them, patience in both directions. Walter washed his hands from the hose, dried them on his work pants, and lowered himself into the chair beside the steps. Desmond told him about the Series B, about the valuation, about the Atlanta Business Chronicle cover. Walter listened without his expression changing. When Desmond finished, the old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She called me, you know." Desmond looked at him. "Bianca. About a year before she filed." Walter looked out at the garden. "Asked me what I thought you were worth. Said it like she was asking about a stock." He paused. "I told her the truth. I said I didn't know yet. Man's still building. You don't put a number on him while the foundation's still going in." Desmond didn't say anything. "She thanked me," Walter said. Very polite about it. But she'd already made up her mind before she finished asking the question. I could hear it. He looked at Desmond. I should have called you. You're telling me now. I am, Walter said. He reached over and put one hand briefly on Desmond's shoulder. Then he stood, picked up his gardening gloves, and went back to work. That evening, Desmond pulled into his parking garage and sat in the car for a moment. He took out his phone. He found her name. He pressed call. She answered on the third ring, and the warmth in her voice was so immediate, so familiar, that he almost felt something before he didn't. They talked for 11 minutes. She was careful. She was charming. She said she'd missed talking to him. She said the news about Bedrock Signal was remarkable. She'd always believed in him. She wanted him to know that. She floated dinner as though it were a small, obvious idea. Closure, she said again. Or maybe just a conversation. He said yes. He said he'd be in touch about the time. He hung up and sat with the quiet of the garage. The next morning, he walked into Kezia's office at 8 and told her. She looked up from her monitor, studied him for a moment. You're going to use this, she said. He picked up the coffee cup from her desk, took a sip, set it back down. I already am. The folder was thin. That was the first thing Desmond noticed. He had expected something thick, the kind of document pile that announced itself. But Kezia placed it on the conference table with one hand and kept her palm flat on top of it for a moment before she sat down, and the way she did it told him everything about the weight it carried. She closed the door first, then the blinds on the interior glass. That was new. Sit down, Desmond. He sat. She opened the folder slowly and turned the first page toward him. It was a printout of an email. The sender address was a personal Gmail account, B. Hargrove 85, a handle he recognized from years back, before Bianca had switched to her work address for everything. The recipient was Petra Holloway. The attachment name read BSIGG Q3 Investor Deck Final.pdf. He knew that file. He had built that file. He had spent 11 days on it during the summer before the divorce, staying up past midnight at the kitchen table while Bianca moved through the apartment around him, bringing him water, asking how it was going. The email was dated 9 months before she filed. Keep reading, Kezia said. He read for 20 minutes. Kezia did not rush him. The folder held 14 printed pages, organized in chronological order. 6 were email chains, 3 were screenshots of text messages, 2 were excerpts from a deposition transcript, highlighted in yellow, with the deponent identified as M. Carroll, former administrative assistant to P. Holloway. The last 3 pages were a summary document Kezia had prepared herself. Dates, names, connections drawn in the clean, precise language of someone who had spent her career building cases that had to hold up under pressure. Bianca had not sent one file. She had sent several, the investor deck, a financial projection model Desmond had revised 4 times that fall, a contact list of rural telecom investors he had assembled over 2 years of conference calls and handshake meetings. In one email, she had forwarded a draft of his federal grant application narrative, the section where he had described, in plain and specific terms, exactly what made Bedrock Signal's routing approach different from anything else in the market. She had sent it to Petra on a Thursday afternoon. He had been at a site walk in Decatur that day. He remembered it because it had rained. Philip had been using the materials to advise a competing startup, a firm called Harrow Bridge Infrastructure, registered in Georgia, positioned to pursue the same federal rural connectivity grant. The text messages between Petra and Philip were direct. In one exchange, Philip wrote, "Get this in front of Daniels before the Birmingham meeting. Make sure he knows BS is undercapitalized." In another, 3 weeks later, "Did you steer the conversation at the mixer?" Petra's reply, "Done. He's not moving toward them." Petra had been attending industry events and feeding investors a story. The story was built on Desmond's own numbers, turned inside out. At the bottom of the final text exchange, Philip wrote, "When this closes, I'll have your fee ready. You earned it." Desmond set the last page down. He looked at the table for a moment, then out the window. The city was bright and indifferent beyond the glass. He thought about the grant application, the 46 days between submission and award. He had not slept well during those 46 days. He had run calculations he didn't share with anyone. He had sat in his car outside the co-working suite one night in January, so tired he could feel it in his back teeth, and made himself a quiet promise that he would not stop. He had been that close to losing it, and he had not known why it felt harder than it should have. He had blamed his own anxiety, his own self-doubt. He had been right about the pressure. He had been wrong about its source. "How long have you had this?" he asked. "The emails surfaced 3 weeks ago," Kezia said. "I spent 2 weeks verifying before I brought it to you. I needed to be sure about the chain of custody on the deposition materials." She folded her hands on the table. "I wanted to be certain before I put this in front of you." Desmond nodded slowly. He picked up the page with the investor deck email again and looked at the date. Held it. "She was in the room," he said. Not a question. "When I built most of this, she was right there." "Yes." He set the page down. His voice stayed level. "Does this rise to tortious interference?" Kezia looked at him without blinking. "For both of them," she said. "It rises to more than that." The dinner with Bianca was still 2 days away. He had made the reservation himself. A restaurant in Buckhead. Her kind of place. Her kind of comfortable. He had planned to sit across from her and read her carefully, and give nothing back. That was still the plan. Every part of it. It had simply become something else entirely. The restaurant was called Sable. It was the kind of place where the lighting was low enough to feel like a secret, and the menus had no prices, because the kind of people who ate there weren't supposed to need them. Buckhead through and through. Bianca had suggested it, and Desmond had agreed without comment, and now he sat at the corner table she had requested. He had confirmed it when he made the reservation, with a glass of still water and no phone on the table. He had arrived 15 minutes early. He watched the door. She came in at 7 on the dot, which told him she had circled the block. Bianca Wright moved through a room the way she always had, not loudly, not with effort, but with the specific ease of a woman who had practiced entering spaces and knew exactly the effect she produced. She was dressed in deep burgundy, something fitted and understated, and her hair was pulled back in the way she knew looked best on her. She had thought about tonight. She had dressed for a version of this she had already scripted in her head. Desmond stood when she reached the table. She smiled, and for a half-second it was the smile he had fallen in love with, the one that reached her eyes before it reached her mouth. He filed that away the same way he filed everything now. Information, weight, and source. "You look good," she said. "So do you," he said. "Sit down." The first 20 minutes were hers, and she used them well. She ordered white wine and asked about the company with the right mixture of genuine curiosity and practiced warmth. Not too eager, not too flat. She said she had read the piece in Atlanta Business Chronicle twice. She said she had always known, and she said it in a tone that walked the line between pride and nostalgia, as if the two of them shared credit for a thing that only one of them had built. Desmond listened. He asked a question about her job, her apartment, a mutual acquaintance from their Georgia Tech years. He was attentive in the way that made people feel seen. It was a skill he had never performed with her before. He was performing it now. She talked about the early years, their first apartment in Grant Park, the one with the radiator that clicked all winter. A trip they had taken to Savannah in year 2, when everything still felt open and possible. She was careful with the memories, selective, warm, nothing that loaded too much weight on either side. She was building something, and she was building it slowly. the way a good marketer builds a case before she makes the ask. He let her build. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, settling back slightly, wine glass in hand, "about what we had. What it actually was." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for sincerity, the slight softening around the eyes, the small pause before the next word. "We had something real, Desmond." "We did," he said, and that much was true. He let the truth of it sit in his voice without decoration, because it cost him nothing to be honest about what had existed before he understood what it had been used for. She moved carefully toward her purpose. She called the original settlement rushed. She said she hadn't been thinking clearly at the time, that the whole process had been painful for both of them, and that decisions made under that kind of stress deserved a second look. She used the word unfair. She said it with a small, rueful shake of her head, as though the unfairness were a weather event neither of them had caused. Desmond rested his forearms on the table. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is genuinely considering something. "And beyond the settlement," she said, quieter now, "I don't know. Maybe that's not the only thing worth revisiting." He let that sit for 3 full seconds. "Tell me about Petra," he said. The shift was so gentle it barely registered as a shift. His tone hadn't changed. His posture hadn't changed. He asked it the way you ask about someone you haven't seen in a while. Mildly, with no edges. She smiled, loose and easy. "Petra's good. Still doing her thing. You know how she is." She took a small sip of wine. "Why?" "I've been thinking about that period," he said. "The last year we were together. The grant process." He tilted his head slightly. "Bianca, during that time, were you ever in contact with anyone about my business? About the grant I was pursuing?" The pause lasted less than a second, but he had been watching for it, and it was there. A small, almost invisible recalibration behind her eyes. The smile stayed in place, but the machinery behind it adjusted, the way a performer adjusts when a line lands differently than rehearsed. "I don't know what you mean." Desmond looked at her. His expression was calm, almost gentle. "I think you do." He did not raise his voice. He did not reach into his jacket. He did not produce a single page from the folder that Kezia had built, with 14 days of careful, documented work. He let the words sit between them like something that had mass and heat and was not going anywhere. The rest of the dinner lasted 22 minutes. The conversation found its way back to the surface. Pleasantries stretched thin over a silence that neither of them named. Bianca recovered her composure, or the shape of it, and they talked about nothing in the careful way that people talk when something real has been introduced into a room and no one is ready to hold it directly. She left first. He watched her cross the restaurant floor, the same practiced ease, the same straight spine, but something in the quality of it had changed. She moved like a woman solving a problem she hadn't expected to have tonight. Desmond finished his water. He set a card on the table without looking at the bill. Then he walked out into the cool Buckhead evening, got into his car, and drove directly to Kezia's office. The confrontations were being scheduled. The attorney's name was Marcus Osei, and he did not waste words. His office was on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street, and at 8:15 in the morning it was already full of sharp light and the quiet hum of a man who had reviewed the folder twice the night before and arrived with conclusions. He was Desmond's litigation attorney, separate from Kezia, a deliberate structural choice, and the separation mattered. Kezia sat in the corner with her own notepad, the same way she would sit in the Hargrove meeting, and said almost nothing. Marcus set 3 manila folders on the desk, one for each name. "Let's go in order," he said. Bianca's exposure was the cleanest to explain, and the most personal to hear. The handwritten margin notes on the divorce petition, her own handwriting, photographed by Desmond 14 months ago, established a documented timeline of financial calculation that predated any disclosed marital grievance. Combined with the forwarded emails Kezia had sourced through Petra's former assistant, the picture was specific. A spouse who had shared confidential business materials during an active marriage, while simultaneously coordinating an exit strategy designed to minimize her financial exposure before any business upswing could be legally shared. Breach of confidentiality is viable, Marcus said. The marriage itself created an implied duty. The documented disclosure of proprietary materials, pitch decks, financials, investor contacts, to a party actively working against Bedrock Signal's interests satisfies the elements. It's not the strongest of the three, but it doesn't need to be. It doesn't stand alone. Desmond nodded once. He did not look at Bianca's folder the way a man looks at something that hurts him. He looked at it the way he looked at load-bearing calculations. Weight, distribution, tolerance. Philip's folder was thicker. Marcus walked through the tortious interference exposure methodically, the text exchanges between Philip and Petra confirming the arrangement, the timeline placing his advisory role in the competing startup squarely within the window of the federal grant competition, the documented pattern of investor conversations steered by Petra using materials that originated from Philip's access to Desmond's household. The interference was not accidental and not incidental. It was coordinated, it had a financial purpose, and it had a near-measurable cost. He ran the play, Marcus said simply. The documentation makes that visible. Then Petra's folder. Marcus opened it and let the weight of it settle before he spoke. Her exposure is categorically different, he said. The other two are personal actors. She's a professional one. She operated in an investment-adjacent capacity and used non-public proprietary information to influence capital allocation in a competitive process. He paused. That is not just tortious interference. That touches her licensing, her professional standing, and depending on how her firm's compliance review lands, potentially her regulatory status with the state's Investment Advisory Oversight Board. Her firm's compliance review, Kezia said from the corner, the first words she had spoken. That's already open. Marcus looked at her. As of when? Yesterday afternoon, Kezia said. The intermediary request went out the morning after the dinner. The compliance officer opened the internal investigation the same day. She wrote something on her notepad and did not look up. Petra doesn't know yet. Marcus nodded slowly, the way a man nods when the pieces are more organized than he expected. He set down his pen. Then the walls are already moving on her track. The press package was Marcus's last item. Desmond's PR firm had been briefed 2 days earlier with careful, specific instructions. Prepare a full feature-length founding narrative for Bedrock Signal. The grant process, the adversarial conditions, the 18 months of solo rebuilding after the co-founder's departure, the proprietary routing protocol developed during the hardest stretch. Every word factual, every detail specific and verifiable. No names, no accusations, just the shape of what had been done and what had been built in spite of it. It doesn't run, Desmond said. Not unless I say so. Understood, Marcus said. But sitting alongside a filed civil complaint that names all three parties, it becomes something else entirely, Desmond said. Yes, Marcus said. It does. The meeting ended at 10:15. Desmond shook Marcus's hand, nodded to Kezia, and walked to his car. He drove south on I-75 with the windows up and the radio off. Walter was in the garden when Desmond pulled up, same as always, crouched between 2 rows of late-season greens, wearing the canvas hat he'd owned for 15 years, moving with the unhurried patience of a man who trusted his soil. He looked up when the car door closed, read Desmond's face in about 3 seconds, and straightened. They sat on the back porch. Walter poured iced tea without asking. Desmond told him everything. He did not rush it. He went in order: the folder, the voicemail, Kezia's findings, the dinner, Marcus's office this morning. Walter listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, without the small sounds people make to signal that they're following. He just listened, hands wrapped around his glass, eyes level. When Desmond finished, Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Tell me when you need me there." That was all. Desmond drove back to Atlanta as the sun dropped behind the tree line, the light going orange and flat across the highway. That evening, he and Kezia sat in his office with the door closed and walked through the sequencing one final time. Philip first, then Petra, then Bianca. Each confrontation had its own logic, its own purpose, its own set of documents and conditions. Each was designed not for theater, but for outcome. Desmond had no interest in spectacle. He had interest in completion. When Kezia left, he sat alone at his desk. The 3 civil complaints were printed and laid side by side in front of him. Bianca's, Philip's, Petra's, each one tabbed, each one ready. He looked at them for a long moment without touching them. He did not feel rage. He felt the particular clarity of a man whose blueprints were complete and whose materials were in place. Construction begins tomorrow. Philip Hargrove arrived at 11 o'clock, sharp. He pulled into Bedrock Signal's parking structure in a silver Mercedes that still had the new car shine, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and walked through the glass doors like a man who had spent his whole life walking into rooms and being welcomed. He was dressed well, dark blazer, no tie, the calculated casual of a man who wanted to seem like he wasn't trying. His handshake was firm. His smile arrived before the rest of him. The receptionist walked him back to the conference room without ceremony. Desmond was already seated at the head of the table. The room was glass on 2 sides, floor to ceiling. Midtown Atlanta spread out behind him, all steel and skyline and morning light. A city that did not care about Philip Hargrove one way or another. Kezia sat in the far corner, notepad open, pen resting in her fingers. She did not stand when Philip entered. She did not smile. Philip glanced at her, registered her, and turned his attention to Desmond. Desmond! He said the name the way you say a word you are relearning. Warm, generous, like a man bestowing something. He pulled out the chair across the table and settled into it with the ease of someone who had never once been caught at anything. I have to say, he gestured vaguely at the office around them, the floor plan, the 50 employees visible through the glass on the other side of the hall. It is genuinely good to see. He paused just long enough to let the implication breathe. Good to see. As in, who would have guessed? As in, look how far you made it. Desmond let him have the moment. Then he reached beside his chair, lifted a manila folder, and placed it on the table in front of Philip. Tabbed. Organized. 3 sections, color-coded at the edges. He did not explain it. He simply opened it and turned it so Philip could read. Philip's face moved through its changes the way a sky moves before a storm. Not all at once. In stages. First, the polite confusion of a man who doesn't yet know what he's looking at. His eyes scanned the first page, a printed copy of the text exchange between himself and Petra, time-stamped, confirming the finder's fee arrangement. His expression stayed neutral, practiced. He turned to the second tab. The forwarded emails, Bianca's personal account to Petra, the pitch deck attachment, the investor contact list with his name visible in a forwarded thread. The confusion shifted. Something behind his eyes started working. Third tab, a timeline, printed in the same clean format Desmond used for engineering documentation. Dates on the left, events on the right, the grant competition window, Philip's involvement with the competing startup, the investor conversations Petra had run at 3 separate industry events using materials that traced back through Bianca to this table and this man. Philip set the page down. He said nothing. Desmond spoke. "The Federal Connectivity Grant," he said. His voice was even. Flat in the way a floor is flat. Not cold, just level. Bedrock Signal won it by a margin of 11 points in the scoring rubric. The competing startup your client was advising scored 9 points lower on financial viability, a category weighted directly against projected infrastructure. The projections they submitted were built on intelligence that came out of my house. He let that land. If they'd scored 2 points higher, the grant goes the other way. Bedrock Signal is insolvent by spring. Philip opened his mouth. Desmond kept going. A civil filing names you as a primary defendant. Tortious interference. Documented coordination. Financial motive confirmed in writing. He turned one page. Your development business runs on relationships. Investors, municipal contacts, anchor partners, all of them connected to the same Atlanta professional networks that will receive, through standard press channels, a factual account of Bedrock Signal's founding and the conditions under which it nearly failed. He looked at Philip directly. Not accusations. Facts. Sourced. Verifiable. Permanent. The calculation behind Philip's eyes sharpened into something that looked briefly, just briefly, like fear. He started. I'm not negotiating, Desmond said. The two words were not loud. They didn't need to be. Philip went quiet. I'm not offering you a deal, Desmond continued. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm not interested in your explanation. He closed the folder. I wanted you to understand what you participated in, what it cost, what it could have taken from someone who had never done a single thing to you. He stood. That understanding is the only courtesy I'm extending. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He stood the way a structure stands, without drama, without question. The meeting was over. Philip walked out past the front desk without a word. The receptionist watched him go with the expression of someone who had not been told what the meeting was about, and did not need to be. Kezia stood at the conference room window. She watched the silver Mercedes back out of the parking structure below and disappear into midtown traffic. She turned to Desmond. One down. Desmond had already returned to the table. He pulled the second folder toward him and opened it to the first tab. Petra Holloway arrived with an attorney. That told Desmond everything he needed to know, and Desmond was not even in the building. He was 2 miles away at the main office, reviewing routing specs, when Kezia sent him a single text. She's here. He read it, set his phone face down, and went back to the specs. His absence from the meeting was not an oversight. It was the first statement. Kezia was already seated when Petra walked into Bedrock Signal's legal office on the 3rd floor. The room was smaller than the conference room upstairs, deliberate. A table, 4 chairs, a window that faced a parking deck. Nothing impressive. Nothing comfortable. Petra looked the same as she always had. Polished, put together. The kind of woman who controlled every visible inch of herself at all times. But her eyes moved too quickly when she entered. They found Kezia, found the folder on the table, found the empty chair where Desmond was not sitting. That last one made her still for just a half second. Her attorney, a trim man in a gray suit, introduced himself. Kezia nodded once. She did not offer her hand. Let's get started, Kezia said. She opened the folder. She did not rush. That was the thing about Kezia. She had the patience of someone who had waited a long time to be in this exact room, and she was not going to sprint through it now. She laid out the first document, the forwarded emails from Bianca's personal account to Petra. 3 of them, each one with a pitch deck or financial projection attached. Each one time-stamped during the final year of the marriage. Petra's attorney leaned forward and studied the pages. Petra looked at them without touching them. The way you look at something you already know is real. The second document. The text exchange between Petra and Philip. Straightforward and damning. Philip confirming the finder's fee. Petra confirming her understanding of what she was expected to deliver. The language was careful. People like them were always careful. But the meaning was not hard to find. Third document. A map, essentially. 6 industry events, over 14 months. At each one, a notation of conversations Petra had initiated with investors, conversations that, according to 3 separate attendees who had since provided written accounts, involved her steering interest away from an unnamed startup and toward a competitor she described as more viable. The unnamed startup was Bedrock Signal. The projections she cited in those conversations matched the materials in Bianca's forwarded emails down to specific line items. Kezia set the timeline beside it. Petra's involvement began 6 months before Bianca filed for divorce, 6 months before the marriage ended publicly, which meant she was not responding to a collapse. She was present at the construction of one. Petra's attorney cleared his throat. "My client, I'm not finished," Kezia said, calm. Not unkind, just absolute. She placed the last document on the table. The civil complaint. 41 pages. Petra Holloway listed as a primary defendant alongside Philip Hargrove. Tortious interference. Professional conduct violation. A discovery request that would require Petra to open every client engagement she had touched in the past 3 years to independent review. Kezia folded her hands on the table. "One condition," she said. "Full signed disclosure. Complete cooperation with the independent audit. Both within 72 hours. She let that number settle. "If your client cooperates, this complaint stays sealed. If she doesn't, it files Monday morning. And the journalist, who has been requesting comment on Bedrock Signal's founding story for 2 weeks, gets a call Sunday night." Petra's attorney said, "We'll need a week to—" 72 hours, Kezia said. She closed her folder. Petra signed 48 hours later. Her firm placed her on administrative leave the same afternoon. The independent audit opened the following morning, and within 4 days it had surfaced 2 additional client engagements from prior years, neither of them connected to Desmond, neither of them clean. Regulatory flags that had nothing to do with Bedrock Signal and everything to do with the kind of person who treats information as currency, regardless of where it comes from. Petra had not built her career on one shortcut. She had built it on many. Desmond's case had simply opened a door. The rest of her history was already standing behind. The finder's fee Philip promised her was never paid. She was gone from Atlanta within the month. That same evening, Desmond drove to Bianca's apartment alone. He had told Walter earlier that afternoon. Walter had listened to all of it at the kitchen table in Macon, coffee going cold in his cup, and when Desmond finished, he simply pushed back his chair and said, "I'll drive up." He didn't ask if he was needed. He knew. He was in the parking lot when Desmond walked toward the building, sitting in the passenger seat of his own car with the window cracked, the way he used to wait outside school. Desmond did not look back at him, but he knew he was there. That was the point. Bianca opened the door, and her face did the thing faces do when hope and dread arrive at the same moment. She was in a simple dress, hair down. She had expected something, not this, but something. She stepped back and let him in. The apartment was tasteful, clean lines, soft lighting, the kind of space that looked like a magazine and felt like a performance. She offered him something to drink. He declined. He sat down on the couch. She sat across from him. He began. He told her about the folder. She already knew he'd found it. She'd known for some time that he must have. But hearing him describe it was different. The photographs he'd taken on his phone. Every page, every margin note in her handwriting, circling questions about asset timing and his business trajectory. The 4-month head start. She opened her mouth. He kept going. He told her about Philip. What Philip had said at the Bar Association event, 8 weeks before the papers were filed, with the loose confidence of a man executing a finished plan. He told her about the competing startup, about her own emails, forwarded from her personal account, carrying his pitch decks and investor contacts and financial projections out of their home and into her brother's hands, and then into Petra's. Bianca said, "That's not," and then stopped He told her about Petra, the industry events, the investor conversation, the 6 months of deliberate, compensated misdirection aimed at the one thing Desmond had built from nothing during the loneliest stretch of his life. He told her what it had cost in real terms, how close Bedrock Signal had come to losing the grant, what losing it would have meant, how precisely calibrated the threat had been. "You weren't just leaving," he said. "You were making sure there was nothing left to leave with." Bianca tried denial first. She didn't know the full extent of what Philip was doing. She had shared some information, yes, but she never intended. He didn't engage it. She tried reframing. Their marriage had been failing for years. She had been unhappy in ways she couldn't name. She had leaned on the people closest to her, and maybe they had acted in ways she hadn't sanctioned. He didn't engage that either. Then she tried the softer thing, the real thing, or the closest she could get to it. Her voice changed register. Her eyes went somewhere honest for a moment, and she said his name the way she used to say it, like it mattered, like it was specific. He looked at her without moving. "We lost 2 babies," he said. His voice stayed level. "We never talked about it. Not really. We just kept going. And I was grieving. And I believe you were grieving. And I let that grief be something between us. Something real. Because I thought you were in it with me." He paused. "You used all of it. Everything real between us. You used it as cover." The room was very quiet. She did not answer. He told her the civil complaint was prepared and named 3 defendants. He told her it would not be filed on one condition: her full cooperation with the ongoing audit and a permanent, written withdrawal of all financial claims against Bedrock Signal. Any future contact with Bedrock Signal's investors, partners, or professional network would trigger immediate filing without further notice. She nodded slowly. Her eyes were wet, but her face was controlled. He could not tell if the grief was for what she'd done or for where it had landed her. He stood. "You thought you were leaving before I could hurt your future," he said. "You were actually leaving the most important thing you'll ever be attached to." He picked up his jacket from the arm of the couch. "I hope the clarity is worth what it cost you." He walked to the door. He did not look back at the room, at the tasteful furniture, at the woman sitting in the soft light with her hands folded in her lap. He pulled the door shut behind him. Walter was still in the car when Desmond came down. The parking lot was quiet. The streetlights made yellow circles on the asphalt. Desmond got in behind the wheel. Walter said nothing. He reached into the back seat and came back with a thermos. He handed it to Desmond without a word. Desmond pulled out of the lot. He got on I-75 south and drove. The city thinned. The lights spread out and then faded. The highway opened up and the night was wide and still on both sides. They drove for 20 minutes in silence. Then Walter said, "You did that right." Desmond's hands were easy on the wheel. His breathing was even. "I know," he said. The tent was white and wide, and it caught the afternoon light the way good things do, softly, without trying. Southwest Atlanta moved around Desmond the way neighborhoods do when they are waking up to something new. Children ran between folding chairs. Old men in good hats stood near the food tables. A woman in a yellow dress took pictures of her daughter touching a community tablet for the first time, holding the phone up with both hands like she was capturing evidence of a miracle. Desmond stood near the edge of the tent in a dark suit, no tie, watching all of it. He was 40 years old. He did not look like a man who had lost anything. The pastor found him first. He was a wide man, short, with a white collar and hands that had clearly done real work before they did God's work. He walked straight to Desmond and took his right hand in both of his and held it there for a moment before he spoke. "My granddaughter did her homework last night," he said. "First time in 2 years. She didn't have to wait for the library to open." He shook Desmond's hand once, firmly, and let it go. "That's yours." "That's what you built," Desmond said. "That's what she built." I just made sure she could get there." The pastor looked at him with the particular look older men give younger ones when they've said something true without knowing how true it was. Then he nodded and moved on. Kezia was at the podium. She wore a burgundy blazer and spoke without notes, because Kezia Durant had never needed notes in her life. Her voice carried easily across the gathered crowd, maybe 200 people, maybe more. She talked about what fiber connectivity actually meant in practical terms. She talked about telehealth access and remote learning and small businesses that could now reach customers beyond their own zip codes. She talked about Bedrock Signal's federal partnership and the 14 additional communities across the Southeast scheduled for expansion by the end of the year. Then she paused, just briefly. "Bedrock Signal started with one man," she said, "who refused to believe that the people counting him out were counting right." A sound moved through the crowd. Not quite applause, something warmer than that. Desmond looked at the ground for a moment, then he looked up. Walter was in the front row. He had driven up from Macon that morning without being asked. He was wearing a charcoal suit that Desmond had never seen before, and his arms were folded across his chest, and his face had the composed, unhurried expression of a man who had known how this story ended before most of it was written. He looked at Desmond. He nodded once. Desmond held it for a moment, that single nod, everything inside it, and then he nodded back. The settled facts lived quietly now, without drama. They did not require revisiting. They simply were. Philip Hargrove's anchor development deal had fallen apart when two investors made the quiet decision to place their capital elsewhere. No announcement, no public accusation. Just the particular way that rooms in certain industries stop, including a person's name in the right conversations. He was doing residential work now, smaller projects in secondary markets outside Atlanta. He understood why. He would always understand why. Petra was in Houston. The administrative leave had become permanent separation within 2 months of the audit concluding. What the compliance team found had extended well past anything connected to Desmond. She had been running ethical shortcuts through her career the way some people run yellow lights, one after another, confident the pattern would hold. It hadn't. She was rebuilding under conditions she had not selected and could not fully control. The finder's fee Philip had promised her was never paid. She was aware of the irony in the way a person is aware of a bruise they keep pressing. Bianca had cooperated fully. The civil complaint was never filed. She had remarried within the year. Someone stable. Someone without particular ambition. Someone who came home at the same time every evening. By every visible measure, her life was fine. The apartment was nice. The neighborhood was pleasant. She was fine. But fine is a different country from the one she had been navigating toward. She lived there now, fully aware of the distance between where she had aimed and where she had landed. And that awareness was its own kind of permanent residence. The crowd had shifted toward the tables. Music came from somewhere. Someone's phone connected to a small speaker. A song with a slow, easy beat. Desmond drifted to the far edge of the tent. A grandmother sat with a child at one of the community tablets, both of them leaning in close. The woman's hand rested on the child's shoulder as the child moved a finger slowly across the screen, learning the weight of it, learning what it could do. The grandmother said something soft, and the child laughed. Desmond watched them. He thought about the kitchen table, the cold coffee, the color-coded drawings spread under the early dark, the whole city still asleep outside, just a man and a blueprint, and the absolute refusal to believe that the distance between where he was and where he was going was anything other than time. He thought about what that man had believed about loyalty, what he had learned about it, what he had built in the space between the two. He did not feel sorry for that man. He felt proud of him. He picked up his coffee, hot now, always hot now, and walked back into the crowd. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.